We're back with the Digital Healthcare Podcast. Joined with a guest, another indie friend, Sunny Lou Williams, president of TechServe. So thanks for joining me in person. It's always fun to do these when you actually have a human to interact with rather than just a computer screen. So that's fun. I wanted to kick off, first, give a little bit about TechServe and your role. So let's start there, and then I want to go way backwards and kind of tell the story.
Sounds good. Hey, Ryan, thanks very much for having me. This is great. So TechServe is a technology solutions and project management company. We started years ago, 26 years ago, actually, in being essentially technology procurement and technology installation. And as the evolution of technology came about, we really identified that it's really workforce that needs to be trained on the technology. We like to say it doesn't deploy itself and it doesn't use itself. So from a workforce side, we really honed in on how to account for workflow, program design, training and technical assistance, and overall the strategy of how to help define further workforce education as technology either comes to be a further interplay with industry-based process, or as technology sometimes becomes a hindrance if the right technology application or technology isn't chosen. So
is that across all of healthcare then, pretty much, or is there specific areas that you focus on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I have a pretty wide healthcare background, have supported organizations from traditional health and hospital systems through to actually at one point designing clinical trials, through to doing population health. Now we're pretty centric on supporting the workforce in healthcare that is outside of the four walls of the hospital.
Interesting.
Our feel is that from my years of experience that's not really the fail point when it comes to, do we have enough tech? Are we trained enough? Is there really workforce courses or development, et cetera? That's really about a fit, right? Did we get the right technology, the right integrators, the right trainers? When you look into community health, which is really what we're corely focused on, we're looking at influencers, stakeholders, non-traditional clinical individuals that are participating literally in the four walls of the home or in the four walls of an institution like our public schools, our workplaces, et cetera, and having and giving those individuals the technology skill up.
Yeah, sure.
And most importantly, a strategy around the program and the why of what we're doing, along with the how that we're doing it.
Are those folks often overlooked just because they're not in the, like you said, the four walls?
Yeah, that's very insightful. Absolutely. So you can have a pretty licensed, managed, and now more or less regulated healthcare workforce by developing new certifications and skills. But really what it comes about is those individuals that have either the healthcare background experience that are just doing the work as volunteers, doing the work as kind of a moonlight of what their traditional 8 to 5 is. And you find a lot of these folks as stakeholders that are coordinators of their local coordinating council, that are executive directors and nonprofits on their off time. And then just general volunteers that are going into churches, schools, their neighbors' homes, and anywhere else that the community is having key healthcare issues.
Interesting. So I imagine the job's pretty fun then, because you get to see it practically implemented, right? Or at least think in those terms, right?
I have been in some very interesting situations where we see how the culture of what a particular demographic, population, cohort, even neighborhood thinks about what is the right treatment or the taboo or the stigma on certain disease states, how it really impacts the overall general health and wellness of the community. So I've gone along ride-alongs with paramedics in the back of a emergency vehicle through to partnering with social workers, entering a home of parents that are unfortunately opioid misusers. So they're persons in recovery. but understanding how they want to get back on the road of sobriety and accounting for all the processes they have to go through to get their children back, get their lives back on track, through to really fun things like engaging in health fairs with the community, where you can actually see community members come out, get education, entertainment, and overall just participating in that health equity in a different way.
All right, let's pause there.
Okay.
I have questions on all that, but I want to go back first. That'll be a teaser to make sure people keep listening.
Sounds good.
Don't leave now if you're listening, because the fun stuff's coming. So I want to go kind of all the way back into your upbringing, because
the way back.
The way back, yeah. Because I know in a little bit of research I did, you have a pretty interesting story. So start as early as you want to go.
Yeah, well, my grandparents were unicorns unto themselves. So my grandfather was the eldest son of a farming family. So like literally China agrarian, like rice paddy, right? Mm-hmm. And he had this phenomenal vision that he wanted to, as a firstborn son, he's pretty much set, right? But he had this phenomenal vision that he wanted to travel. He wanted to see more of the world. So he joined the Army at 19, and during a very pivotal transitional time frame. That was the time frame where the U.S. just finished World War I, going into World War II. China, from that perspective, was having lots of issues with Japan. So I won't get all geopolitical on this response.
All right. Thank you for that.
But ultimately, my grandfather had this vision to say, I want to do something more. And so he joined the Army and used his military career to later ultimately deflect from China during that regime and settle in Taiwan. Okay. My grandmother was the second daughter of a second wife in China. So if you know your history or if you know Chinese history, typically the second daughter of a second wife is not going to aspire too much. She also had a vision to say, I want to be educated. Her mother was illiterate her entire life. And she said, I want to be educated. And so I think out of great struggle, because there were wars going on, comes really a great definition of character. So my grandparents somehow met each other. So two great visionaries came together. And they had goals for their children and their children's children. And so my grandmother, whose mother was illiterate, and my grandfather, who came from a very agrarian society, put into the goals for their family that every single one of their children would go to college, an experience that they never had. And every single one of their children would go overseas. And so what was interesting is that of my father, his two brothers and sisters, they all have master's degrees or above, have all studied in the States, which is a astronomical feat during that time frame. They're all entrepreneurs, and they've built lives for themselves based upon what the benefits that their parents gave them. So I was born in Taipei, and I had the opportunity at a very young age to understand what a healthcare system looks like when it is backed by comprehensive government support. So Taiwan is a very much a kind of, it's almost like a socialist democracy, and the government provides a lot of support services. Obviously, it's taxed; the people are taxed to account for that, but it's a very different environment.
Sure.
And then I had the opportunity years later when I was still...
Real quick on that, how did you... Was that through some sort of medical issue, or was it just a part of studies that you did?
So I was born in Taipei, and I was raised in Taipei and came to the States when I was 3. Then I went back every summer to Taiwan and just saw the long time, through that experience, the long time impact of how healthcare was so different in Taipei. So it's kind of
compare, contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, where in the States, except for potentially urgent care, could you go and receive a primary care physician appointment in one day, right? Literally go in the morning, get your number, and go and see the doctor. And then as my grandparents aged, ultimately my grandfather was a long-term diabetic, ultimately had a stroke, which exacerbated some other mental, I don't want to say mental illness, but
mental problems,
physical brain issues developing into Alzheimer's, etc. And that experience that I went through with them was night and day compared to, at the time, I was working with some home health agencies on remote patient monitoring, and then also dealing with some telehealth in the senior living facility. So I think that there was always this really interesting dynamic of what I was experiencing personally to what I was involved in on a career progression. And there was just this really interesting dichotomy of why do we do things this way, right? And so as I got older and had more experiences with myself within the U.S. healthcare and then the Taiwanese healthcare system, I also had an opportunity to compare and contrast that with the UK health system through the National Health Services. I had the opportunity to study abroad. When I was at undergrad at Purdue, I did a year at London School of Economics. And so had to use the healthcare system for various colds, et cetera. And then had spent some time in Ontario, Canada, when we did telehealth years later to really kind of compare and contrast those systems, right? So that was fascinating to me, just in the sense of there's other ways to do it. And there's no good, bad, or indifferent. It's what does the population need? And do we have the resource capacity and the overall healthcare infrastructure to support that?
Sure. So jumping back to your family real quick, just to underscore that, when you say firstborn male or second daughter, so are those cultural, social kind of definitions?
Those are very much social cultural norms of the time. So the time was the late 30s, early 40s, 1930s, 1940s, and that was very much still indicative of really a culture that was progressing into what is now known today as a nuclear family.
Sure.
Right. So back in the day, I would say that for my grandparents to have had those very fiercely independent visions of what they wanted in a quote unquote normalized society was really out there.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to underscore. It's not like a first college graduate or something along those lines. These are going hard against what's normal, right?
So I don't know if you want to call it the rebel gene or if you want to call it just, to be polite, a visionary gene. But if you want to just say, hey, this is kind of the gene of flying in the face of social norms of why do we do what we're doing today? Yeah. And if it's not benefiting other people, then why do we still keep doing it?
Yeah, and maybe the lesson is don't blindly accept them.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
That's the trap I follow.
Yeah,
it's like
that's a good
everyone
point.
does it this way, so I need to do it this way, which isn't always the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a great disparity between what's safe and then what's acceptable.
Yeah, sure.
Right? And so how do we define acceptability? And when we look at it from a healthcare perspective, we've gone very far from what the patient actually needs and wants to what our healthcare institutional infrastructure is actually delivering.
Right. So one more question, then we'll go full in on healthcare. Is there any any big lessons or ideas, anything that jumps out that your family imparted on you?
Yeah.
And then I'm curious, were those expectations set on you that you were going to go do all this? Because I know that's that's a definite stereotype from an Asian perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
That it's really hardly pressed on them. And I'm just curious what your experiences were.
Yeah, so you do have a good background in Asian culture. I wouldn't say that implicitly my grandparents or my family was like, you must do this. But there was always a stream of, because of where you're at today, you have an obligation and a responsibility to see more and do more, because I don't believe in the myth of meritocracy, right? I wouldn't be here today if my grandparents didn't have that vision, if they didn't put forth that fortitude and perseverance, and if my parents didn't do the same thing, right? I wouldn't speak essentially perfect English today if my parents didn't account for the education and the overall in some ways expectations, but also the opportunity. And so when I look at that, there was always an obligation to give back, because what we earned today was not earned simply on our own merits. It was a lot of luck, a lot of paving the way from prior generations. And because of where we're at, there was always this underlying theme of you do not deserve to be entitled. So if you are kind of in the social strata, so to speak, if you have a better position than others, then it is your obligation and responsibility to do what you can to account for equity across the board. Now, granted, back in the day when I was a young kid, those words were not used.
Yeah, right.
Back in the day, it was more so along the lines of, whatever you want to do, you have to define what you want to do. And once you get there, help others define what they want to do and help them get there. And that's been a central theme across just how my grandparents and my parents have raised me. And I really appreciate that.
I bet. It probably gives you so much motivation and purpose.
Yeah, a little pressure.
Yeah,
a little
oh, yeah. A little pressure's not bad, though.
Yeah. No, it's good.
Because I think about my grandmother passed away from cancer.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Just like you, when you're in the healthcare world for a personal reason, it takes such a different light, and you start to see all the inefficiencies and problems. But then if you tie it back to your work and can find a way to do that, for me, it's given me so much energy, because it's
good.
like that motivates me to continue to try to be better. And I'm sure it kind of comes along the same thread as your background, taking full advantage of the opportunities you're given, which is essentially a message.
And I think that's so powerful. And I think what you're really hitting on is, jobs are jobs sometimes. And there's the things that you have to do, the things that you're like, oh, I'd rather leave that than take it. But then having a higher purpose for why you're doing it. And that's a lovely story for why you're so focused within Lilly and the oncology field. That's beautiful. I think that it comes back to say, outside of all the stuff, right, that you'd rather not deal with, there's this wonderful, at the end of the day, kind of inherent value to you of why you do it. And I think for a lot of our folks, I work with a lot of nurses, the stuff that you'd rather leave at the end of the day piles and piles and piles on. And if that stuff destroys your purpose, then I think ultimately that's the saddest part of what our healthcare system is doing to its workforce. Yeah,
absolutely. So let's talk about your story then. So you mentioned you interacted with the healthcare industry all throughout the world, literally, throughout your experiences. So did you go into school knowing that was the direction you wanted to head?
No.
Okay.
I went to school thinking I was going to be an attorney. And I actually thought I was going to be an environmental law attorney. And then one day it just randomly dawned on me that those are really long cases. Like to fight an environmental law case is like a really, really long time. There's some formative things that I think happen in your early childhood. So I was one of those nerds at early childhood. I watched The Pelican Brief probably earlier than I should have.
Great movie.
Yeah, but it was so monumental to me, right?
It's hard not to be a lawyer after seeing that.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. So that was like a motivational moment. I have a paper from second grade that said, hey, want to be a environmental law attorney. Everybody else was like firefighter, astronaut, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I want to be an attorney. And people are like, what? So
that's hilarious.
I actually, I feel like now that was more like an escape, right? I wanted to be an attorney because my entire family was either doctors or computer science.
You wanted to break that mold.
And I wanted to run as far away as possible from that. I wasn't one for blood, so I knew that I wouldn't be able to really manage the patient care aspect. So in my family at the time, aspiring OBGYN, aspiring neurosurgeon, the neurosurgeon became a neurosurgeon, the OBGYN went into dermatology because in our healthcare infrastructure, the insurance liability on OBGYN was so high, right? Then all of the computer science folks, including my dad and my mom is a accountant, but ultimately focused on, the whole supply chain aspect of technology. I was like, I don't want to deal with this feast and famine entrepreneurship. I don't want to deal with, blood and patients and whatnot. I'm going to go a whole different professional services route.
Would you pause there real quick? That's exactly how I figured out what I didn't like.
Yes.
Much more than I figured out what I liked. And it was kind of a process of elimination. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely.
For you? Okay.
Absolutely. And I think that's so spot on that we need to teach anyone, not just our kids, anyone looking for direction of try it.
Yeah.
Try it. If you don't like it, good. You've narrowed it down.
Yep.
But there are very few people, and I find them to be incredibly lucky, that know from the start exactly what they want to do. And I'm like, good for you. That's awesome.
Yeah. I always hear, the phrase I always hear is do what you love and you never work a day.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, finding out what you love is the hard part.
Right.
You know, once you figure that out, then you can
Right.
kind of back into
Right.
not working at all. But yeah.
And I would say if I did what I love, I don't want to be a food critic. And I love to eat. I don't want to be an editor of, you know, great books. I just want to enjoy that for enjoying it. Right. But this trajectory in, as you rightly said, this trying and defining and seeing what you don't want to do just allowed me to say, well, if I don't want to do it, I got to do something. So let's just take the opportunity. So,
and that's probably another important point.
Yeah.
Don't just get after it. You know,
Yeah.
don't, the more time you spend just kind of wavering
Yes.
and just thinking about it, the less time you're actually progressing.
There's this failure to launch, right?
Yeah.
Kind of phrase. And I would say that the only thing that really prevents someone from failure to launch is the fear of not being able to succeed, and a hidden fear of inadequacy. And ultimately, you're not going to succeed the first time that you try something. If you did, great, luck, right? Or if you did, great, prodigy. But you got to still practice. You got to still do it on a day-to-day. So what I found interesting was this trajectory, now almost 20 years later, really got to me to exactly where I wanted to be, not ever knowing that would be the path.
It's weird how it looks.
Yeah.
I think Steve Jobs said when you look back, it all looks perfect and laid out exactly how you're supposed to. But in the moment, it doesn't always look so clear cut.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great quote because ultimately it speaks to the individuality of choice that we have here in today's present day and age and in our country today. And I think that part of that is almost paralyzing to say, I have all of this choice. Yeah. I can really go in any direction. So how do I choose?
Yeah. I mean, most of humanity didn't have, you know, find food, find
Yeah.
shelter.
Exactly. Basic survival.
Yeah. It's only recently. I mean, that's kind of a blown out version of what you said, but it is so true. I mean,
but I would add a fourth element to our basic principles, like our basic needs, right? Food, shelter, security. I would add in today's day and age a fourth realm of purpose. And there's a lot of folks that are really struggling with their mental health because they can't wrap around, or they won't wrap around, or in some cases they haven't gotten to that point yet within their own mental health that they can make a decision on where they want to go. And having worked in this field, having been a caregiver for individuals that have really struggled with either kind of quote unquote inherent mental health concerns or trauma-based events for mental health, this fourth realm of purpose, right, is really, if we don't know it, it becomes the most toxic thing. If we do know it and we strive for it, at least from an individual choice perspective, we can account for, I'm trying this, pause, do I like it or not? I'm trying this, am I good at it or not? Do I give some more time? What does that look like? I've failed in numerous times. I mean, so many times that I can't even be like, hey, Brian, these are the definitive times that I failed, and this is what I did. You know, I think I need some more careful reflection to be like, here are the exact times that were pivotal to me. No, but I think that what's been beneficial is that in those experiences, I either failed fast and said, no, this is not for me, or I had a strong enough support network around me to say, hey, you've forgotten your purpose, or this doesn't seem like you, or you're really stuck in a rut. Like
sometimes for me, it's the glass is 95% full, and I'm focused on the 5% that's empty. And it takes someone to say, you're doing okay.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely.
Don't beat yourself up.
Absolutely. And that positive reinforcement goes a long way as well, because we can become very myopic about the areas of expertise that we have. And so I really love working in kind of the space that I'm in today, because you can't ask for perfection. You can only ask for what is better than the current process, because that already is a magnifier to how much benefit and how much support you're providing to the community.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so we left off. We're gonna eventually get through your full story.
Okay, got it.
Right, you left off.
I'm really good about talking about healthcare topics, not as much about myself. So you keep redirecting.
No, you keep going. I love tangents are the best part about podcasts, and it's long form, so we can go on as many tangents as you want. So that's perfect. Okay, so you were planning environmental attorney. So when did
Oh,
that
yeah.
kind of pivot?
So actually, it pivoted before orientation. So I deferred and never went back. So that school, sorry.
Yep. Okay.
Great institution. Would have been thrilled to go. So I pivoted, and my parents were like, "What are you going to do? This is all you've talked about since second grade, right?" So like, what? And I'm like, "I don't know." So the worst thing that you can say to somebody now, after not only having my own life experience, but actually going through mental health trainings and courses, et cetera, is to say to somebody when obviously kind of their purpose or reality has fallen apart,
Yeah,
to be like,
sure.
now what? What are you going to do now, right? So I decided to head back to Taiwan.
Okay.
I think everybody goes back to their safe spaces, right? So that to me was a safe space. My grandmother and my grandfather was living at the time, and they, you know how grandparents just phrase things a different way than your parents, where your parents mean well and they love you, but they're like, I'm so nervous that what's going to happen. Let me put all of my, stress and concern and worry on you. Whereas the grandparents like, you're not even 20, like, or at the time it was 22. I was like, you're not even, you haven't even lived. Don't even worry about it, right? So I went back to Taiwan, had some great conversations with my grandparents to just essentially say, what do I want to do, right? So my grandmother gave me some great advice, which I shared earlier, which is just start.
Yeah.
See, take the opportunity, you'll figure it out, and just go from there. So I just started at my then company, Telemon, and 13 years later, I acquired the division that I built and started my own company, which in hindsight, as you said earlier, it looks perfect, right?
Yeah, right.
Oh my goodness, there was so many unknowns, and I really even up to last April in acquiring my division, I had to have a hard push from my then boss and still now mentor and advisor, Albert Chen, the founder of Telemon Corporation, that was like, you can do this. I'm like, oh, I don't think I can. I'm like, what do you mean, own payroll? I mean, do all of these things?
Yeah.
I don't know about this, right? And sometimes to just start, it may not be you that has the confidence, but it might be your support network that gives you the push and says, you can do this, without you even truly having the confidence or truly identifying how you can do it. I kept, to your analogy of 95% water, right? I kept looking at the 5% of like, oh, all of these things
this
can
could
happen,
blow up.
right?
Yeah.
And so I ended up doing a tactic. I used to run track years ago, and my coach would always say, visualize the win. And I changed it a little bit because sales in healthcare is slow. So visualizing the win is a little bit harder. And so it takes almost like the win out of the sales, right? So I started visualizing the worst case scenario and then asking myself, if that actually happened, could I cope with it? And if I found a scenario that if I visualized the worst case scenario and it would happen, I couldn't cope with it, then that was almost like a risk mitigation strategy to say, how do you then prevent that thing from happening? And then how do you put those plans in place earlier so that you're always looking at from different angles, what is the worst case scenario and how can you prevent that?
That sounds kind of doomsday. It's not though, right?
It's not, because as an entrepreneur, and I've had lots of opportunities over the years in launching new technologies, creating new organizations, building up, scaling capacity. And I've had a lot of long hours, but I've never worked harder than as an entrepreneur, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the infrastructure is you and your teammates. And so I look at it not so much as a doomsday, but as a practice in resiliency, to say, if you cannot know what your reaction is going to be in the worst case scenario, worst time frame, well then, how do you prepare for it?
Yeah, right. Then it might happen.
Yeah, then it might happen. And
if it does, you're in a tough spot.
Exactly. So I'll share a very personal story
Sure.
with you. So like I said, last April, I acquired the company. This April, we celebrated, we're still alive. In June, or rather in July, we celebrated our 27th anniversary because I acquired my division, then merged it with TechServe. And TechServe was actually a long-time family-owned organization. Merged them. We opened a second office in Indianapolis. And I thought, okay, we got a ton of great contracts from both federal and also state governments. So we had won within a very short time frame. Within the last we submitted a bunch of proposals in April of 2019, and we won to date 80% of them.
Wow.
So in a 6-week period, we were submitting a proposal a week. It was insane. Brian,
that sounds like no sleep.
It was no sleep. It was like gain 5 pounds because all you're doing is sitting and writing and eating and stressing.
Yep.
And so I said, oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I'm so excited we have these contracts. I can't wait. We're doing these implementations. Fantastic. My team is great. We've hired new people. They're spot on. They're doing all this great work. Okay, I've got all my things planned out from July through to next April. We had launches, dates, conferences, because a lot of times with these healthcare programs, you have to do education. So, the most networking, collaborative way that we still do it is the traditional conference, right? The workshops, summits, etc. Everything's planned out. It's beautiful. I can't wait. I'm like,
I know.
okay,
I'm waiting for the ball to drop.
Yeah. So the ball is actually a live thing. I found out after I planned all of these things out through next April that my husband and I are expecting our first child.
Whoa! Congrats.
Thank you. So 3 weeks ago, I found out I was 4 months pregnant.
Oh.
So it's one of those things where you're like, okay, that wasn't
in the plan.
Yeah, it wasn't in the plan. It's not considered worst case scenario per se, but it is considered that was not something that I would have foreseen. It was not an angle that I would have been like, oh yeah, so what if this happened, right? I mean, you can't count on tomorrow.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to happen on your drive home, whatever the case might be. But I laugh at this because we really had this all planned out. And then I went, oh my goodness, I'm going to need to take a moment here. Yeah. So we had to rework everything, replan. I have, I think every leader thinks they have the greatest team in the world, but I really have the greatest team in the world. Basically, the team sat down and was like, we got this. Yeah. No worries. Yeah. Fine. You'll be great. And they were like super excited and like planning all this stuff. Had no concerns about what was going to go on. And as a business owner and as a leader, I'm incredibly grateful for that.
Yeah, it really tugs at your heart when you because you never know how good your team is until you really need
exactly.
Them. I've had the same experience where teams have just helped you through all those bumpy parts, and you come away and just you have a newfound appreciation for the team that you didn't know was even possible. So, well, that's awesome. Congrats.
Yeah, thank you.
On behalf of all the listeners, we're celebrating with you. So that'll be fun.
You should all listen to the Healthcare Podcast because you get huge announcements like this one.
Yeah, right. Breaking news.
Breaking news.
Yeah. So cool. So then, the 13 years you spent prior to acquiring it, I guess what were some of the highlights there? Did you have I'm sure you had a handful of different roles, right?
I had some phenomenal experiences. Albert Chen is definitely a person who knows how to pick the right people. And I don't just say that in kind of deference to myself. I'm saying that in great leaders are people who know people. And Albert so many times pushed me totally out of my comfort level, but had trust in me that I would get it done. And I look back on several programs and situations where I would say, man, if it were me leading me, I probably would have fired me. Not because I did anything unethical, not because there was any malicious intent, none of that. It's just simply, you don't think you had the competency to actually do the job that you did then. But I will always be grateful to Albert because he allowed me the opportunity to fail. And most organizations will not permit that in their people or even permit that within their own organization. And so I can count on two really kind of pivotal situations. One was a glowing success, and the other was just a terrible failure. Okay. But both great learning experiences. So let's start with the failure.
The juicy stuff.
The juicy stuff, yeah. So I had the pleasure with a team of about 200 people to deploy the first ever Android phone in participation with Google HTC, and then Brightpoint. And we decided, we decided, HTC and Google decided that Telamon at the time, being such a great partner, would actually do the contact center, the aftermarket logistics, everything dealing with kind of training users of a first time ever smartphone, right? So the Nexus
That's
One.
That's funny, isn't it? Just in itself, the smartphone training. Now you give it to a 2-year-old.
Right, exactly. No, but at the time, Brian, at the time,
I believe it.
Our call times were 40 plus minutes long because people had never navigated. I mean, we were going from like BlackBerry scroll through icons to like apps, right?
Yep.
And so it was phenomenal. And so that was an incredible experience in having very high-tech folks like Google, very equipment-based engineering design folks like HTC, very logistics-based folks like Brightpoint, and then ultimately us who were supposed to be fully customer service proficient, all four of us having no idea how this was actually going to play out in the marketplace with the consumer. And so you can say, hey, did you guys do your market studies, your consumer focus groups, et cetera? It's brand new technology. I almost attribute it to the point of when did home TVs first come out?
Yeah, right.
When did, and these kind of revolutionary technologies.
Shape-shifting.
Yes, absolutely disruptive, right? And so that project, I would say, in my view, from my opinion, was a failure because we never met those market numbers of as far as total distribution, total worldwide sales, all of those different aspects. Someone had a brilliant idea to engrave the phones. So let's think about that. If you engrave a phone and you get the message wrong, what's the return policy look like, right? So there's all sorts of learnings and such. But that's when I really looked at it and I went, wow, workforce training and development, nay, not just workforce, right? Like consumer-based adoption of technology is a game changer. So how do we do that more? So that was from a fail point. That was absolutely the beginnings of how do I do this applied tech to workforce?
Yeah, and that's probably a perfect lead-in to healthcare.
Yeah.
So that's what we lack so much is
that's
just
exactly
the
right.
patient perspective on how to bridge the gap from theory to actual practical use.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And when we look at it from a technology adoption through to when does clinical research actually get to patient protocol? Very, very long time frames.
Yeah.
So
that you said that as failure. I'm guessing the failure was you didn't meet your metrics, right?
Yes.
But on a personal level, I have to imagine that was one of the more impactful times of your career, right?
It was. It absolutely was. It was a very, very high speed, fast, fast learning time frame because we're talking about this was one of the first iterations of software meets hardware meets workflow
and probably
meets supply
Google,
chain distribution.
Trying to remember the timing, you'd probably know better.
Yeah.
That was when Google was trying to catch the iPhone too.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that just added to the pressure.
It was a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, but it was also a really fun team.
Yeah,
the Google guys were great. They came in, they're like, you guys use an actual whiteboard? And that's like one of my most seminal memories of our interactions because they came into our shop in Indy and I was like, I would love a $100,000 digital whiteboard. Please ship one to me, right? Otherwise, good old marker and eraser is going to get the job done.
Works just fine.
I'm like, we have Visio.
yeah.
So, no, it was great. So on the flip side of it, the success part was we at the time when I first came into Telamon, I didn't really have any what I would consider marketable skills. I was a humanities. I was a liberal arts undergrad through Purdue. I was pre-law, poli-sci, philosophy. I mean, all of the things that were for a law school track, right? But I always just really enjoyed numbers, so I liked economics. So I took economics, and I ultimately, when I went to London School of Economics, when I went to LSE as a Hansard scholar, it was political systems meets macroeconomics.
Okay.
And so again, nerd alert, right? It was really fun. I loved it. I thought it was very exciting, and economics was what saved me because ultimately it made me look at it from a perspective of you have these great governance models. You have these great political systems, and at the end of the day, it's a merger between set precedents, law, and socialized norms, right? So the economies of that pairing to what our consumer buying interests are, what our overall gross domestic product, what we're importing, exporting, all of these things still have impact back into the behavioral economic side of how we decide what we sell, what we're passionate about, what we bring as value as services and products to the table, right?
So that's like the highest level possible, to look down on things, right? Was it more of a theoretical type of degree where you weren't getting into the actual practical application of it?
So yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. So on the LSE side, we were all looking at theory. But what was interesting is for that Hansard Scholars program, you had to pick an internship to actually apply it.
That's smart.
So, right.
So you
because,
don't get caught in this bubble
exactly.
of,
Yeah, exactly. So I chose, to this day, it's kind of unbeknownst to me why I chose it. I feel like, again, one of those things, you look hindsight and it's 2020, right? So I chose to intern for the Women's National Commission. So the Women's National Commission was this quasi-state agency, comparable quasi-state agency within British Parliament that essentially focused on women's issues across the world. And so I got to take behavioral economics theory and apply it to these, what did we call them? There's these tenders. So requests for proposals, grants, etc., on very physical things like how to give microloans to Afghani women to build wells for their neighborhoods and their communities so they didn't have to trek hours upon hours a day. Because if your economic viability is trekking to a water, whether it's a water hole, lake, or whatever the case, and coming back, that's not much economic value, right, except for the fact that you're not dehydrated and thirsting to death.
Right,
I don't
right.
know.
You're
Is that a word? Yes, you're surviving. It's a survival economics, right? But if you were to microloan to these women that are essentially the purveyors of water, right? How important is water? Basic element, right?
Yep.
Then you're creating this really interesting community-based or neighborhood-based micro business scale. And so it was these things that ultimately I decided after the study abroad period was over, I decided still to leave and not take a position there because I really was tired of just writing it and not doing it.
Yeah, sure. That's what I was going to ask. Did you have, because I know you had entrepreneurship kind of float around you from a family perspective.
Yeah.
Were you just looking for an avenue to get into that space, or were you still kind of floating in the unknown?
I was definitely still floating in the unknown. Okay. I was like, this is cool. I'm trying it. I like it. But I didn't like at the time writing about these cool processes, actually working with water engineers to say, like, how would you do this with it? And then pulling all of that content together. So just think of it as, on one hand, just project managing all of these documents. But on the other hand, I'm like, I really want to do this. Like, I want to go to Afghanistan and see this happen, right? So that was kind of a central theme that's come to me now, where any document that we write, any grant, any program design, I want to go see it. I want to go live it, right? Because if you're an engineer and you're just creating the prototypes or creating the product, but you don't see how the user uses it, you're missing a whole fundamental aspect of that, right? It's the same thing for us. We could consider ourselves, quote unquote, content engineers, if you will. I mean, if you want to, if I want to inflate that, inflate what we do so much. But it ultimately comes down to, how did you visualize it? How was it then documented on paper? How did somebody else interpret it? And then how was it actually tweaked, change managed, and ultimately implemented in the actual field? And that's the part that I think if anyone in any job today doesn't get to see the benefit of how their service or product is being used, they need to have that, because the purpose ultimately should be accounting for making somebody's life better.
Yeah. And I think that we touched on the day-to-day admin, whatever stuff that takes away from your purpose. I would say that's another one where so much of what a lot of us do in healthcare, you're 5 steps removed from the actual application. So you have to, a couple people I mentor, I was encouraging, find ways to stay connected to that.
That's great.
Everything you do, at least in theory, adds up to this whole that impacts patient lives. But a lot of times I found in healthcare jobs, it's not it's not a one-to-one
It's not.
direct. So you just kind of got to find a way to hold true to it.
Yeah, and that's a great point and great mentoring advice.
Yeah, and all the pieces add up to the whole.
Absolutely.
One way or another. So even if you're supporting servers or network,
like
that still counts.
Exactly.
You still get to take credit for being a part of the whole. So.
Absolutely.
But it's sometimes not the easiest thing in the day.
It isn't because it comes back down to this kind of very human judgment of, well, how far removed are you from actually doing the beneficial patient-driven work, right?
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be looked at that. It should be looked at, just as in economics, it should be considered the whole ecosystem.
Right.
If any one person in that ecosystem doesn't have compassion and passion for their job, then how does that magnify through?
Yeah, it matters.
That ecosystem.
Yep. Okay, so you worked 13 years, and did you seriously had no inclination that you were headed towards a divestiture or taking on the other company? So your motivation going through those 13 years was simply do good work, connect with your purpose, grow your career, I assume, and then I guess when did it start?
Yeah, I wish it was so. I wish it was so like streamlined like that. But what was interesting is I became essentially a firefighter within Telamon.
Okay, you go where the fires are.
Yeah. So I was always asked to look at operations turnaround for whatever reason. So that's a good segue leading back to one of the greatest successes. So when I came on board at Telamon, I had my parents live in Chicago. I grew up in the southwest suburbs of Chicago, in a city called Naperville. And at the time when I was going through and like, I don't know what I want to do with my life, and I deferred from law school, I said, okay, well, I'll just look for something in Chicago. And I took on the position with Telamon. I was with them, helping them essentially put together marketing packages, etc., for, 6 or 7 months when it was. Now imagine you are, at the time, my title was like marketing associate, right?
Sure.
And then you're their CEO of your company, and at that time, I think Telamon was about 140 million, had about 200 or 300 employees. Comes to you as the marketing associate and goes, "Don't you live in Naperville?" And you're just like, "Oh my gosh!"
That's a loaded question.
This founder is talking to me right now. Oh my God, what is going on? And so I'm like, "Yes, I do." He goes, "Well, we have this new acquisition in Aurora, which is like 15 minutes away from actually the acquisition of my parents' house were 15 minutes away." So I just remember being 20 something, going, "This is a great opportunity," but also thinking, I just moved from my parents' house from my parents' house to Indianapolis, right? And now I'm getting sent back to Chicago. And I'm like, this timing did not work out very well. So what ended up happening was the acquisition was a contact center, distribution center, logistics, basically a technology call center. And I remember going through it, and it was one of my, I would say, greatest successes, because I was thrown into it, and they're like, "Okay, we want you to be an account manager," because I was still fluent in Chinese, and I am still fluent, but I was fluent in Chinese, whereas the team there had great technical capabilities, but nobody spoke Chinese, and the majority of the support that we were doing was for Taiwanese and Chinese firms that had imported products from routers to switches to just all sorts of enterprise level connectivity hardware. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, I speak Chinese well, but as with any area of expertise, you need to know the terminology of that industry.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm like Googling, going, okay, so how do you say wireless LAN equipment, like in Chinese, right? I'm like, this is crazy. So we ended up, and I was the only person from headquarters to ever have gone to that acquisition, which is still strange to me to this day. It's like, how could you possibly acquire an organization that you didn't know the leadership, the culture, the team, etc.? So anyways, I got fully integrated with those folks. It was a 24/7 tech support center. We built it into being a network operations center for some major telecom firms. Then with that success, they came back and said, okay, well, you only have like 20 people here in the Indianapolis office, and it was very dismal, like 20 people. And you've seen cubicle farms, right?
Yep.
So it was not like the most exciting place to work, etc. So we spruced it up and brought a whole culture in, and we grew that contact center there to 180 seats, where we had to end up shuttling people from other parking lots within the Carmel area to account for building that out. So that was a great success in the sense that we met metrics, we accounted for growth, we accounted for scalability and capacity. And I went from one organization of building out a team to become specialized in a technology in technologies that I wasn't even an expert in, but really honing my listening skills to people that knew more than me, had for better expertise, and just was collaborative to say, okay, we'll teach you what you need to know. You still need to do the sales, the marketing, all the account management aspect of it. You still have to do that. But to really collaborate with folks that understood their craft and appreciated your role in what you did. And then coming back and going from 20 to 10x was phenomenal. And every time something else happened, we just grew that division more and more and more, because the easiest way to fight a fire is with people. Yeah. Right? That's why when you
turn your people against it.
Yeah. When you have a bigger fire, you need more firefighters. So this whole team became phenomenal for collaboration. There was a totally different culture. And the call center, reverse logistics and supply chain ebbs and flows, right?
Yeah.
It's very, very disruptive for the workforce, because either the minutes are there, the packages are there, or they're not.
Yeah.
And so we had a really good opportunity to say, well, these folks might not be who you would hire on paper, but they absolutely have the expertise and the education and information there. We had high school graduates that just loved technology, learned it on their own, really just that was their passion. That was their purpose, right? And instead of just tinkling in their garage or whatever, they decided that they wanted to come into customer service and teach other people.
Sure.
So having that as the purpose is something totally different. We ended up having team members. So we became a recruiting ground for companies in Indianapolis, like Ingersoll Rand, Rolls-Royce. We actually worked with a huge organization out in Huntsville, Alabama, which was I still can't say their name to this day, but
that's okay.
But the huge organization that essentially acquired, relocated, and placed all of our tier 3 support staff that was working on their product line. I mean, these were guys that were making maybe $20 an hour with us. And they got into roles where they weren't there was a master's degrees in engineering. Now they were getting paid $80,000 to $100,000 a year because they knew the product line, they knew the technology. And so it was this incredibly gratifying understanding to say, hey, there is upward mobility, not only within the company, but then also with our partners. A fit's a fit, right?
Sure.
And so there were many times that I was like, oh, we're doing so well. Time to leave. Time to do something else. Yeah. I really never thought that I was going to be a careered contact center individual or a careered supply chain individual. I still, even during this time as we were doing all this good work, still didn't know what it was that I really wanted to do. Right. Yeah. But I did know as all of this continued to grow, I was like, oh, I don't have enough core competency for me to even run this as a business. So I ended up working 60 to 70-hour weeks and then taking an evening MBA class through IU Kelley School of Business in the evenings. And my grades were terrible because I just directly applied everything I learned that evening. Like I literally would go, our classes were 6 to 9. I would leave from 6 to 9 p.m. I would leave from IUPUI campus, drive back to my office because we were a 24/7 shop.
Sure.
And implement things with the third shift. That's what we did, right? Because I was like, I don't know how to. There are certain things that I just didn't know how to do.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this then, because I think there's a fine line in terms of your next role.
Yeah.
You want to get put into a position that's not something that you're completely comfortable in.
Yes, 100%.
But you also don't want it to be so overwhelming that you can't be successful.
So let me address that, because I think that's a really great point. I feel very strongly about this. I would have to say that I have been very blessed in my professional career to have excellent mentors and supporters all along the way. But in so doing, in so having, an individual has to understand that their direct employer is not responsible for getting them there 100% of the way. There is the things that you must learn to account for your organization providing you the education to do the job well, the expectations, and the overall safety, quality, governance, work instructions, etc. But in order for you to learn the market and the industry of how your job is impacted and how your job impacts, that's on you, and that's professional development. Right. So if you have a large organization like Lily, who's just very focused on professional development, fantastic. Find the group, association, course, whatever, and go and learn it. But if you're with a smaller organization that doesn't have those resources, or you're with an organization, God forbid, that doesn't
even care,
yeah. then there's more than enough information out there. But you have to have the hunger to learn. Yeah. And then the last part of this is you have to have a network of individuals within your industry that you can use as a sounding board. Right. To say, am I totally off base?
Yeah, a safe place.
Yeah, a safe place. Yep. Exactly. And then on the flip side of that, essentially a critics board, right? To say, am I crazy? Yep. Or is this going to work?
For me, that's my wife.
Yeah, that's great. That's
she
great.
Says,
yeah.
Routinely says in the most loving way, you're an idiot. Yeah. And then I know, okay, I'm not doing that. Okay, that makes sense.
Having a very supportive spouse is very straightforward, is also great.
Yeah.
But no, that's important.
And I guess I would add maybe one more thing, and I want to know if you'd agree. I think it's on kind of what we talked about earlier, that it's on you to try things and figure out what you want.
Yes.
Because if you, I think a lot of times, and I know I fell into that trap when I graduated school, came out, and when you're in school, everything's predefined. You have your next midterm, your next final.
Yep.
Then you come in the real world, and it's like, okay, no one's really telling me where I need to get to in the next 5 years. So it's kind of on you to plan it out and think through it. And it's, again, a tricky balance, because you don't want to try to plan it out to a T, because you know that's going to be wrong. But at the same time, you need to have some sort of direction, or be trying to figure out your direction.
And that's very important. I think that a lot of folks that are in great organizations that have a very long corporate ladder almost get into a certain complacency, right? Yeah. But we don't live in an environment anymore where you have a 20-year job. That's not the scenario. We have jobs being created every day that we didn't exist the previous day. Yep. So I think your commentary on needing to always be looking at or thinking through what's next, although that might cause stress, is good, because we are not secure in our current professional selves. Yep. It's the whole industry, whether you want to call it industry, market, or just generally the world is changing so fast that you really need to account for how am I applicable on a day-to-day basis.
What's next? Yeah. What's coming in the future? Sure. Yeah. So with your new role, I guess what's changed the most, and has it been about what you expected, or vastly different?
It's exactly what I expected, and nothing that I've ever expected at the same time. Okay. It's a very odd dynamic of things. So my job is to make payroll. That's it. That's very simplified. You can say, oh yeah, it's sales, it's leadership. Nope. At the end of the day, I asked people to come on a journey with me. I've asked more and more people to come on a journey with me. So that's my fiduciary responsibility. That's my overall. If I do this, great. Everybody is secure. All the families are good. And we account for.
That's a heavy burden too, right?
It is a heavy burden. And I will tell you, Ryan, that in the beginning, I knew it was going to be a burden, but I didn't know to what extent. Because if you're a good leader, you always want to give your people more, especially for a team that has done so much, right? And is so loyal and is just awesome. Did I say that enough about my team? But ultimately, it comes down to as an entrepreneur in a very defined, very government-focused business, very public health, very centric to difficult problems, right? Like we work on maternal and infant mortality. We work on opioid epidemic. We work on how to have education equity. I mean, these are tough problems. These are not problems that you'd be like, oh, next quarter solved. Great.
Yeah,
Check on the dashboard. No, these are really difficult problems that require compassionate people that believe that those problems are worth solving, and passionate people to get over the humps where
power through those tough times.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. The most unexpected part of everything in this interaction, I would say, is actually on a very personal level. My husband and I used to be like the quote unquote power couple in healthcare because he was formerly with Roche Diagnostics, and he knew how to he knew the FDA process inside and out. He launched 13 different point of care diagnostic IT products over that time frame. And so he knew point of care, hospitals, integration, interoperability inside and out. Whereas I was on the patient care population health management side and saying, okay, so how do we get those test results faster? How do we get that information together and then pulling it together? So it was a good friend of ours that basically coined us the healthcare IT power couple. And then going into this business, so we doubled down, and Rob actually is our CTO.
Oh, great.
That was the most unexpected, thinking, oh, we've always worked together very well, always been each other's sounding board. And when we entered into our own company, I really had to look for mentors and advisors that had built successful companies as a couple to give me advice.
Yeah,
because it's I would love to say it wasn't me that had the ego trip, but actually it was. To say, okay, no, this is...
your husband's laughing somewhere.
Yes, he is. This is how I'm going to get him to listen to the healthcare podcast. No, I'm just kidding. But it was this weird situation where it's like, because I had to have my hands in everything, I started like encroaching upon his technology space. And he is one of those unicorns where he understands hardware, he understands software, he understands the composite of kind of IT integration. And I was like, no, you shouldn't do it that way. And then I had to pause while I was in this meeting going, why am I giving him?
Yeah.
Like, why am I giving him direction at all? Do I know? No. My favorite, when Rob and I were still dating, I asked him to explain middleware to me. And he pulled out sugar packets at a restaurant that we were at and did this phenomenal explanation. I'm like, you should do this for Khan Academy. And people will totally understand what middleware is. This is great. But not just like the definition of middleware, but the intricacies of why it's still an industry and why there are still, these wonderful enterprise class devices that are doing all of this, heavy machinery work, machine learning work. And so I'm here going, this is the guy that taught me middleware through sugar packets going, no, you shouldn't do it this way for this software. I didn't even know what we were talking about. And I had to catch myself and go, why did I just do that?
Yeah, right.
Right. So that was unexpected, in which I didn't ever consciously think that I would let it get to my head. But there's a couple of, real pockets of time here during the last 18 months that I went, we're doing so well. This is exactly how we're going to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And not really sitting back, listening and saying, okay, why shouldn't this be the way that we do it from a technology perspective versus from a business perspective?
Sure. That's not the easiest thing to recognize. You need good friends to highlight that, right?
We are very open in communication. So he was very direct in being like, what are you doing?
Yeah. Well, that's great. Can I get your verbal commitment for a second part?
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
We're on a time crunch, and I have so much more. We teased earlier all the different health things, so we'll further tease those and stop here. So I think this time, hopefully, we highlighted your story with a handful of tangents thrown in. So thanks for that. Is there any kind of closing thoughts, just looking back on career, anything that we maybe missed or you want to highlight?
No, I don't think we missed anything. Thanks for being a great interviewer. I would just leave it as, if you've ever had a gut feel, a continued dream, or a constant thought. Don't be fearful to take that next step.
Something to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not always going to work out exactly how you want it to work out, but in taking that step, you're opening up innumerable paths of opportunity. And then it's up to you to decide on which way you want to go.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time. And yeah, let's do a second part and we can go deep into healthcare. we tried our best, but I wanted to highlight your story because it's such a cool, I think it's so important because for anyone that wants to be an entrepreneur or wants to be a leader, I think hearing the steps and progression is important because it's easy to get earlier in your career and think, oh, that's not possible for me, but it's just a bunch of steps and a bunch of decisions in a row that add up. So
well said.
I'm really glad you highlighted it. I'm walking away inspired, and there's a bunch of little nuggets I can take away. So I'm sure there's tons of others that others
That's very
are going
kind. Thank
to be
you.
interested. So thanks so much. We'll be back again
Thanks,
for
Brian.
part 2.
Thanks, Brian.